Well, hi, I'm Alejandro Parra. Um, Not going to happen. Alejandro couldn't be here today, and he asked me to present his paper for him. Please bear with me. I may not know a lot of the details that are involved here. Luckily, Alejandro provides very text-dense slides. I'm not going to read them to you, okay? But I will try to convey the meaning behind what he's doing. His study was related to looking at the psychomanteum and determining whether the psychomanteum created a psi-conducive state. So, let's see what we got here. Aha, there we go. I'm not familiar enough with the slides either here. So the psychomanteum is essentially, and I'll go into more detail in a second, but it was related to crystal gazing. It was one time where people used to look into mirrors or look into crystals and try to get information. They would see things in the mirror. This is an older practice, but it was revived. I'm just going to bring this all up. It was revived by Raymond Moody back in the 1970s, and he worked with Diane Archangel to create try to create an environment where people who were grieving, people who were going through a grieving process, had lost a loved one, so that they could have an opportunity to communicate with their loved ones. Some people in here probably know more about the psychomanteum than I do, and if you do, I would welcome any comments whenever we're finished here. But it was a way to try to facilitate reunions, help people get through their grief. Now, different hypotheses have been presented related to this, and Alejandro focused on Dean Radin, who presented a number of different hypotheses, one of them being that the psychomanteum was actually spirit communication, and there were spirits that were actually in the room with people. What would happen is people would be staring at this mirror in a very dark room, and they would try to communicate with their loved ones, and oftentimes they would see the spirit of their loved one either in the mirror or feel the presence in the room. Well, Dean said maybe that spirit is actually there, and maybe it is communicating. But he also said there's some other possible explanations. And one of them is that perhaps the person who is looking into the mirror is having some sort of telepathic connection. And that telepathic connection is being expressed as an external stimuli. In order to understand it, we can't rationally understand that voices come from nowhere, or information might come into our mind from nowhere. And so psychologically, we create a situation that makes it easy for us to understand where these might be coming from. And we may generate an apparition, because that makes more sense to us than a voice that just comes from nowhere. So this is one of the ways that Dean talked about, a potential way that the psychomanteum might work. Now, another way that it might work is there's a state called hypnagogia. And the hypnagogic state occurs between waking and sleeping. And there's a lot of imagery that occurs in the hypnagogic state. It's possible that something about the psychomanteum and being in this environment, it's a dark room, a mirror, and very, very low light. Something about being in that environment activates the hypnagogic state and allows these hallucinations or these images, these deep images, to be observed. It's also not so different than other forms of sensory deprivation. For example, within the Gansfeld environment, people wear headphones with white noise. They have ping pong balls over their eyes with a red light shining on it. And they're in a very relaxed state, or in a very relaxed chair, and it provides a form of sensory deprivation. It's possible the psychomanteum does something similar and provides something that could provide a hallucinatory state, which may also be psi-conducive. And so what they were looking at was whether there was a psi-conducive component. So this study, I'm just going to read this part. The objective was to explore whether the psychomanteum technique produced a psi-conducive state, which rendered the participants scoring above chance on a Ganzfeld-like telepathy experiment. I'll explain that whenever we get into the procedure a bit. The hypotheses were that there was a significant difference between the psychomanteum and the control condition, and that the psychomanteum would induce a non-ordinary state of consciousness. And this non-ordinary state of consciousness would enable ESP to occur. So essentially, he was running an ESP test and trying to use the psychomanteum as a way to increase scores on the ESP test. Some details on the participants. Essentially, there were 130 participants in this study. You can see you recruited them from different ways. They didn't know the hypothesis of the experiment. They didn't have any idea why they were doing this psychomanteum thing or not, or that there was a mirror involved. They didn't know, and as part of the recruitment, they did sign consents and everything, but they didn't know exactly what was being studied here. Besides giving them this ESP test and putting them in this condition, all of the participants were asked to, they got a little packet beforehand, and there were a couple different instruments that were used, a couple different surveys that were done. One of them was called the Betz vividness of imagery scale. I'm not familiar with this survey. Since they're in Argentina, they used the Spanish language version of it. It essentially determines how likely are people to generate images. How clearly do they see images? How good are they at creating images? One of the other instruments that they use is Barrett's hallucination questionnaire. Again, Spanish language version. And this is another scale that is used to determine how likely someone is to produce a hallucination. So in one case, they're trying to say, can they produce a hallucination? How likely is that to occur? In another case, they're saying, how vivid are their images? How clear is their perception of images? So can they produce hallucinations, and how clearly do they see them? These were two of the different instruments they used before they started this study. So the procedure, there was a whole bunch of different images that were generated on a CD. What they had is they had different rooms. I'm going to move on to this slide, because this makes it a little easier to understand. They had one room, which was a psychomanteum chamber. You can see it at the upper left over here. And they would have a person, the participant in the study, would be in that room and would be in a very relaxed state in a very comfortable chair. There'd be a mirror in front of them. And behind them, there was a light, just to give a really, really low level of light in the room. The room was essentially a dark room. There was no light getting into it. Everything was black. But they had a really low level of light so that people could see the mirror and get some sort of feedback from the mirror. The experimenter would be in this area here, in the experimenter place. Over here, you can see separated from stairs, down across another room, down a hallway, and through a couple doors, is where there was a sender. And the sender was looking at a computer. This is very similar to a Ganzfeld setup. The sender would be looking at, there was a pool of images that were on this computer, about 2,500 images, I think it was. And randomly, once everyone was in place, someone who wasn't part of the experiment at all would randomly generate a number that would determine which image should be shown on the computer here. That would be the target for the experiment. The sender would then see the image and start trying to send it. For about 20 minutes, they'd try to send that image to the participant who was in the receiver place in the psychomanteum chamber. The experimenter had no contact with the sender at all, and only had contact with the receiver in order to get them all set up and make sure the psychomanteum was working and make sure they were safe during the study. There were two different conditions. In one condition, the participant would be looking into the mirror and with this low level of light. In a second condition, the participant would be in the dark room, completely dark. Nothing, no psychomanteum at all. The mirror would be covered, so that was the control condition in this case. They would sit there and they would just be told, relax, however you're comfortable relaxing, and just think about what you're perceiving as it's happening. In a psychomanteum condition, the mirror would be uncovered, there would be a low level of light, and they would be seeing reflections in the mirror. Supposedly, they would see hallucinations. This is what the psychomanteum was designed for. Hallucinations or images that might reflect what's being sent from the sender computer. The whole time, they're talking. They have some white noise going on in their ears, and they're talking about what their perceptions are, and it's being recorded. As soon as this 20 minutes is up, they now have, we know there's a target that was chosen randomly. We have mentation and impressions that the receiver had. At this point, this random participant, this random experimenter again would choose 3 decoy targets as well. So we'd end up with 4 photographs that would be displayed on a computer screen. The participant would look at the computer screen, see all 4 of the images, and try to determine which one was the target. So they have a 1 in 4 chance to get it right. 25%, right? You got 4 targets, and one of them is the real one. They're guessing which one it is, and which one corresponds to their experience whenever they were in the receiver. So the concept is that there would be a difference when someone was in a psychomanteum state than when they weren't. This would indicate the psychomanteum actually had a more psi-conducive result. This is Alejandro in the psychomanteum lab. This is another picture of someone in the lab, and here is Alejandro looking mysterious and kind of dangerous. Essentially the psychomanteum condition, the participants went through a recorded relaxation. They would sit in front of a mirror, and then they would try to determine what the target was later. In the control condition, the participant would just be in the room with their eyes closed in a completely dark room, no mirror involved, no mechanism for hallucination. As I said, the experimenter didn't have any contact. The sender would look at the target, and then the experiment would tell the sender when to start and when to end the experiment. So the results. In this case, there were 4 different rankings that they could give. Either first place, like this target looks like it's first place, it's most likely the one that was being sent. They could say, oh, this one was second, third, and fourth. So they would rank the pictures that were on the screen to say which one was most likely. First place hits. You would expect 25%. That's chance expectation. You can see first place hits. In the psychomanteum condition, it was 30.8% of the time that they got it correct. In the non-psychomanteum condition, it was 29.2%. Both of these are significant and indicate that, hey, there was a difference, there was a variation from chance in both of these conditions. But the goal of this study was to say, is the psychomanteum condition better at inducing psi than the non-psychomanteum condition? Well, in this case, no, it didn't really show any difference. And some of you might be able to interpret this. I didn't really know how to interpret this statistics, but it demonstrates that the difference between the two conditions, it didn't demonstrate that the psychomanteum actually had an effect. So, the score was higher for the psychomanteum condition than the control, but the difference was insignificant. So there was nothing that could demonstrate that the psychomanteum produced an altered state of consciousness that was more psi-conducive. But there were some questions about what is this non-psychomanteum condition where you're essentially having someone sit in a chair in the dark and saying, relax. What is this? Is there something about this state? We have to define that state a little more clearly rather than just giving people free rein on it. Also, some people mentioned that there wasn't a control group. You see, every participant went through both conditions, the psychomanteum condition and the non-psychomanteum condition. So there wasn't a control group that did one or that didn't do either and then was trying to guess it. There was no control related to that. The final thing here is that the participants, some of them who were in the psychomanteum, they talked about having some relaxation. They were feeling really good for the psychomanteum. Sorry, I don't really understand that part of it. It seemed, remember the scales I talked about related to imagery and hallucinations and how vivid your imagery is? It seems that imagery is really important related to the ESP, to psychomanteum condition and ESP ability. But in this study, the participants who scored low on visual imagery actually scored better on the ESP test. So they had lower scores, they were less likely to have visual imagery, and they scored better on the ESP portion. But in support of the telepathy hypothesis, I'll read through this. Perhaps intense telepathic rapport affects brain functioning, causing a telepathic communication to be perceived as though it was projected from outside the body. Sometimes in the form of the sender's image, as is often reported in cases of crisis of telepathy. For more information, please contact Alejandro. I'll try to answer any questions.
Thank you so much. I don't know how many of you knew Arthur Hastings. Yes, we have some raise of hands. He was a member of the SSC as well as IONS and most likely the Parapsychology Association as well. And I distinctively remember his experiments with this very psychomanteum. And I think that it would be so interesting to do this invoking him, because he's the researcher, so he's now on the other side. He passed away in April 2014, and I think that would be really cool.
So looking for that cooperative spirit, it seems. Is Julie still here? Yeah.
In your earlier talk, you were emphasizing the importance of context. And I thought of that because the description you gave of the original phenomenon talked about the viewers as being in extreme states of emotional distress,
Yes.
which wasn't true of the participants.
Right.
So it seems like it's like a different thing altogether, really, because of that.
That's very true, and I will communicate that back to Alejandro and let him know. I think that's a really good point.
Also in the original psychomanteum work, my understanding is that the participant really spent a whole day with Moody, and he really worked a really personal connection with them to get them in this right, you might say, global sense of feeling before even going into the psychomanteum. So I have a feeling that the preparation time and expectation really makes a difference here in terms of how you experience this and how it can be compared to the original. The other comments I have is I think you said that the participant looks at all 4 pictures.
Yes.
Okay, now you can't really rule out precognition
Right.
because you might be going ahead and being drawn to one that's more attractive than the other. So that could diffuse the results. And the other comment I'd like to make is I really would like to have psychologists and those in the parapsychology field stop using the word hallucination. We're talking about mental imagery. Hallucination goes back to the psychiatric wards when people are half nuts, then they named hallucination.
Hallucination has had different meaning within the field of parapsychology. Remember that Alejandro's first language is Spanish. So, good.
Fair enough. I thought it was a really interesting talk, the idea of the mirror experience. Recently, a friend of mine, Dr. Richard Restak, who's a neuroscientist, wrote an article for one of the peer-reviewed journals that involved a fellow by the name of Giovanni Caputo, who is an Italian neuroscientist who had an experiment in which he basically had participants basically sit in a chair in a nearly dark room, and then about 5 feet away from a mirror that would be sitting on another chair, full-length mirror on the other chair. And the idea is that they would have to sit in that room for 5 minutes and just stare at their own reflection in near darkness in the mirror. And of course, for a neuroscientist, all they really cared about was the results of what those people were experiencing. And what they were experiencing were incredibly bizarre things in the mirror. I mean, and when you think about it, so immediately when I read that, it harkens me back to Bloody Mary, okay? Because when I was young, that's what we used to play. And really, that's a young version of what you're talking about. The psychomanteum process is really Bloody Mary, PhD style, right? And so what's interesting is that when you think about Bloody Mary, you're really doing that really after spinning around 13 times and then chanting Bloody Mary, and then you're looking at the mirror and you're saying in the mirror with as much conviction that you are the one who killed her child, and then Bloody Mary is supposed to come out and reach out of the mirror and grab you and pull you into the mirror. And what's crazy about it is that you really do freak out in that moment when you're a kid, and if you're like a young, pre-adolescent girl, at a slumber party doing this, it turns into like a crazy hysteria. The interesting thing to me is that in his article, he talked about that as being a delusion, that he was talking about this as being a delusion, and similar to like what Dale was saying in calling these hallucinations, it really does it makes me wonder whether or not, as a person who actually experiences something inside the mirror, whether or not there is something that's relevant. So I find that your talk regarding particularly how the difference between the psi experience and the mental imagery experience is very different. Yet I tend to think that there is something interesting with regards to finding elements of your answer. I mean, in other words, almost like the ayahuasca experience, sort of finding your spirit who ends up giving you answers to things that you need to know that you may not know, can be found in that mirror. And I know that also in the black magic mirror concept is also about that idea of kind of using the mirror as a way of being able to get some sort of guidance from your spirit guides, if you will. So I don't know. I thought it was a great talk, so thank you very much.
It was good. You have some good points there, and a lot of times crystal gazing can be considered to be a reflection of your subconscious, whether your desires, your fears, and so this is why it was used by Raymond Moody to try to help people overcome grief, to help them get through it for this. Also related to the Bloody Mary thing, there's a new thing called Charlie, Charlie, Charlie. Yeah, look it up. Yeah, it's the new Bloody Mary now.
Could you please run back to the slide that had the table of outcome numbers on it so that those of us who are comfortable doing our own statistical analyses could jot them down? Thank you.
This is the comparison between the two conditions. The one before that. Okay.
Okay, while York is jotting that down, I do want to mention something about Arthur Hastings' work, because Arthur was working with the deceased, and you're working with images.
Yes.
So images are more static in a way than, some spirit body out there that you're trying to connect to, so that there's something to be thought about that there, but I'm looking forward to Julie. Say hi for me to Arthur, will you, while you're in there. Okay, let's give John a great round of applause.
Alejandro.